My name is Robert Vaughn, and I am a professor of law at the Washington College of Law, and so it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this important conference. It's appropriate that this conference is held here for a number of reasons. It's appropriate because of our program on law and government and the presence on our faculty of one of the country's preeminent scholars on food and drug law. It's appropriate because of our focus on employment law and our program on law and business. It's appropriate because of our environmental law program and our emphasis on human rights, particularly the rights of immigrants. But it's particularly important because of two women, Ellen Spencer Mussey and Emma Gillette. These two women were suffragettes. They had applied for admission to a number of law schools and been denied because they were women. Undeterred, they founded their own law school with a vision of legal education for both men and women. 115 years later, the Washington College of Law stands for the values that they espoused. Fighting for justice for women required resolution and courage. During a suffragette march in Washington, D.C. in World War I, a mob set upon the marchers, and Ellen Spencer Mussey was seriously injured. As have some members of our faculty now. These women risked their lives for their beliefs. Appropriately, one of WCL's earliest mottos was emblazoned on a banner. That motto is now part of our values. That motto was 4 words long, and it was used to describe the use of the law for noble purposes. It read, "Right arrayed against might." On behalf of the Washington College of Law, I welcome you to this conference.
Thank you, Bob, for that introduction to this conference. From a personal perspective, it is so appropriate that the Washington College of Law and the Government Accountability Project have joined forces to launch the public interest implementation program and effort surrounding the remedial legislation entitled the Food Safety Modernization Act. Nearly 37 years ago, I was a quasi-expatriate living in the jungles of Brazil, and I wrote an essay to get into the Washington College of Law, which they accepted. And who was on the committee was Robert Vaughn. And so many years later, actually during that time, Robert Vaughn had just published the seminal work, The Spoiled System. And that became one of the foundations and the influence for President Carter's reform of the civil service system. Professor Vaughn and this law school has remained the epicenter for all legal academic work on the subject of whistleblower laws, foreign, federal, state, and local. He likewise was my mentor then and remains so today. Actually, since leaving law school, I've only had one employer, the GAP, Government Accountability Project. So I know our history dealing with the subject of food integrity concerns. In fact, GAP itself was launched at a conference, a whistleblower conference, in 1977. Featured at that conference was John Copeland, who at the time was the most investigated man, innocent man of integrity in America. He was a food a food grader in Chicago whose task was to grade meat between its levels of quality, choice, good, fair, etc. He also was courageous, and he took his concerns about bribery to the prosecutors, and he became the star witness against scores of food managers, food grader managers, as well as corporate bribers. His courage and cooperation with prosecutors capped his own career development at the Department of Agriculture. And it doomed him to decades of meritless allegation and attack. But it also laid the foundation for Senator Leahy's own investigation, Senate investigation, into the need for whistleblower protection for federal civil servants. Eventually, that investigation led to legislative proposals, and that was folded into Carter's civil service reform legislation, and obviously the culmination of what Robert Vaughn himself was calling for in his own work. But that remains a work in progress, as we know. Congress continues to grope with a desperate need to legislate adequate protections for the federal civil service force. But during the last lame duck session of Congress, that was the subject of developing whistleblower legislation for federal civil servants, but which has left them in purgatory for months more and perhaps years more. We will be hearing a lot about another act that was actually passed during the lame duck session, and that, of course, is the Food Safety Modernization Act. We'll be hearing that throughout the day, and hopefully today will be the launching of the campaign for the implementation, for the effective implementation of that law. And it certainly has laid the foundation for our own campaign, which we are also launching, which is essentially to help develop protection for all those involved in food production in the United States, from farm to fork to disposal. But even with the act that was passed during the lame duck session, that was only part of the loaf of what we're after. Because what remains is whistleblower protection for those who handle meat and poultry meat products. It, as you know, or no, as you'll learn, should say, it covers eggs, but it doesn't cover poultry meat. Perhaps overly simply put, those in the food chain that created the cheese pizzas are now covered, but those involved in the manufacture of pepperoni pizza are still out of luck. After today, hearing from whistleblowers, legal scholars and practitioners, public interest experts, and government and union officials, you will hopefully come away with both knowledge and motivation to make reform work for all of us. We all have an interest in these topics because we are all consumers of products that not only nourish us and give us pleasure, but also can make us ill and occasionally kill us. I've been asked to mention GAP's long history of working with courageous corporate and government whistleblowers to expose food integrity corruption. I will merely mention a few highlights. My list will leave much out. In 1980, we sponsored John Copeland's post-retirement national tour. When he retired, he took his retirement funds, he bought a trailer, and with the help of GAP, he launched a campaign going throughout the country, going into grocery store chains, and evaluating their meat as to whether it was properly graded. He found that most choice meat was only good, most good was only fair, some fare should have been dog food, but that might have been inhumane as well. In the 1980s, we exposed rampant meat processing violations in California slaughterhouses. We went on to expose rampant contamination endemic to the new poultry processing facilities with their fast line speeds, their fecal soup baths, and their feather beating rather than plucking operations. That led to the now classic TV show or TV program, 60 Minutes on the poultry industry, that was aired in 1987. That show is, reportedly that show, led to the decline in poultry prices throughout the country for an entire year. For years, we have fought one national deregulatory effort after the other, all toward the goal of turning over inspection over to the corporations from the government. That has yet to succeed, fortunately. In the early 1990s, ABC's Primetime Live broadcast a program on our investigation of a grocery store chain called Food Lion. 19 whistleblowers exposed practices, such practices as dipping turkeys into bleach water so that you can throw them back on the shelf for a week or two. Also, the practice of slopping tomato sauce on date-expired chicken so that you could not only put them back on the shelf, but raise the price. We represented the whistleblowing food processor plant owner, John Munsell, in his efforts to rally other small processor plants to force the Department of Agriculture to trace back and investigate the E. coli saturated meat he had received from ConAgra. Finally, I come to the bittersweet mention of Department of Agriculture veterinarian Dean Wyatt, who was repeatedly referred to at our last Food Integrity Conference here at the law school in November 2009. He at the time was preparing for his blockbuster congressional testimony about practices, inhumane practices that he had observed at an Oklahoma and a Vermont slaughterhouse. At the time of that conference, the owner of the Vermont facility was threatening to sue Dr. Wyatt. He blamed the vet for the actions of the U.S. Humane Society, which had successfully captured and broadcast horrific animal abuse on video at that facility. Since that time, Dr. Wyatt was tragically stricken by a rare and aggressive brain cancer. It was his commitment that has helped us to establish our food integrity program from farm to fork to disposal. His courage, integrity, and tenacity has inspired us to continue to do what we do. None of this work would have been possible without the public interest allies, without employee unions, without academic backup, without funders, and fundamentally without whistleblowers. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I call your attention to a delegation of Russian anti-corruption visitors who will be here at some point, off and on during the day. They're visiting the United States at the auspices of the Department of State as well as Department of Justice. Please greet them and welcome them. For years and years, after we began our work in Russia with environmental activists, I would wear pins in my lapel from their organizations as a constant reminder of how difficult it is in their country to be that kind of activists that we are. We get frustrated, but we have nothing to compare to what they experienced day in and day out, both before and after the end of the Cold War. Finally, just to announce, as you know, this conference is being filmed. So if your presence here is secret, maybe you should stay toward the back rows, hopefully. If you're shy, maybe that as well. Now it's my pleasure to introduce a man who absolutely does not need introduction, certainly in legal tort circles, William Marler. He has dedicated his life and his legal career to making as whole as our legal system allows the victims of food safety breakdowns. His goal is to put himself out of business by helping to create a truly safe food environment for our entire nation. Thank you.
I might be one of the shy ones, but maybe not. I was a little late this morning, and I apologize, but the good news is I have something I sort of can, you want to get out of your way? I have something I can sort of tell you that happened. I got to meet with the Justice Department this morning, along with a young man, I think he's young, he's in his 40s, whose mother died from eating salmonella-contaminated peanut butter. And many of the victims of that outbreak have been instrumental both in the passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Many of them came here multiple times over the last year, but also have been very open about their desire to see the president of that company prosecuted for his crime. And we have constantly, myself included, have been constantly probing and sort of pushing the Justice Department along. And I can tell you that they would not tell us much, but said the fact that we're talking to you should speak volumes. And so I had about a half-hour, 45-minute meeting today with 3 prosecutors, an FBI agent, somebody from the OCI, and what the outcome of that is going to be is clearly in the hands of justice. But I think the great thing is that justice moves slowly, sometimes so slowly that it's hard to imagine if it ever will get there. But the fact of the matter is that justice is moving, and that's a good thing. I almost feel like I could talk the entire time about that, but that's not why they asked me to come here. So, but I'm really happy about that. I look out in the audience, and I see so many people who have fought for this food safety bill for such a long time. Some, with heavy hearts, and some with very little pay. And I think the 2 people I'm not going to tell who they are, but they know exactly who they are. And the really fascinating thing about this food safety bill, to me, is how it was almost like a relay race. Carolyn would carry the ball for a while. Nancy would pick it up, flip it to somebody else. And then came really sort of a series of events that sort of catapulted into the public domain, catapulted it into the sort of public consciousness. At the same time, the politics was ripe. You've had, and Carolyn knows this. I mean, food safety has been talked about for decades. The food, FDA hadn't been sort of reworked for some 75, 80 years. But yet, we had a series of tragedies. We had a series of difficult outbreaks that sickened, hundreds and killed people, all kind of coming together at the same time where the Congress flipped parties and where you'd never get hearings before hearings started happening and things started moving and people started joining the fray. Victims who had never been, and some of them are going to be here today, some of them had no political experience, have taken dozens of trips to Washington, D.C. and sort of backed up Nancy and, backed up Carolyn and the other people who've sort of pushed food safety. Those people, who lost, family members or who children were sick, and, those are real heroes. We forget about those people. And in my business, and it was one of the things I told the Justice Department this morning, is that everybody forgets the victim. Nobody sits across the table from them at their dining room table where you listen to them explain how it was that their daughter died. Nobody from the government comes to listen to them. Nobody from the Justice Department comes and listens to them. And for God's sakes, nobody from the businesses that poisoned their kid comes to sit across the kitchen table from them and listen to that story. Nobody does. But the fact that some of these people took it upon themselves to come to Washington, D.C., to buttonhole a Congress member, to buttonhole a senator, to come back, to talk to the press, to tell their story again and again and again, to pick that wound, to pick that scab, to tell that story in an emotional way. You got to know that those people are all our heroes. Those people are sort of the salt of the earth of America who make it right for all of us. And I think that the people in this conference, the people who, have influence on policy can never forget those people. And, I think a lot about, the impact that these people have on my life. And, as a trial lawyer, the cliches about trial lawyers are sort of always easy to sort of beat up on. I've got a Mercedes-Benz, I have gold Rolex watches, I fly around in jets, I just care about the money. And I've taken a lot of money from the food companies. A lot. And they keep poisoning people, and I'll keep doing that. But the fact of the matter is that, at some point in my life, I realized that change wasn't going to happen the way I thought it was going to happen as a lawyer. Some of my trial lawyer friends probably won't like me saying this, but I really believed when I started out doing this that civil litigation by suing companies would change their behavior. And it's not the way it really is. It's a part. It's a small, very small part. But as I learned along the way, and as I sat across the table from victims, and I heard their stories again and again and again, and saw now 2 decades. I used to have dark hair and a little bit thinner many decades ago when I started doing this. The reality is that so much of what I see and what I do is sort of like that Bill Murray, movie Groundhog's Day. It just keeps happening. The names change, the businesses change. Sometimes the businesses are the same. You mentioned ConAgra. I think I could, find the ConAgra corporate facility in my sleep. I've been there so many times. But the stories are all the same, and they're all really tragic. And the victims come and the victims go, and the reality is that nobody has taken responsibility for those people, except some people here in this room and, arguably myself. But what I learned in those decades, frankly, fairly early on, was that civil justice system wasn't enough. There was more to do. There was more outreach to do to victims groups. There was more communication to have with whistleblower organizations and more communication to have with politicians. Because the one thing that I think I've learned about human behavior It's a little bit like the relay race that happened for the Food Safety Modernization Act, is you never know when you push, when pushing is going to be enough. What I mean by that is, so many people become victims and they sit back. So many people are happy to get their paycheck and go home. But the people that are willing to sort of press and to keep pressing, and then maybe get tired and somebody else presses, you never know when change is going to happen. You never know when change is going to happen. And that's, I think that's says volumes about our ability as human beings to effectuate change in our society. Not to sound sort of silly, but it's kind of like that butterfly effect. Does the butterfly in the Amazon cause the hurricane, in the Caribbean? Well, the people, my clients, the people who've stood up to corporations and have come to Washington, D.C. and keep pushing, they're like the butterfly. You never know when it's going to happen, but if you don't help it happen, if you don't push it, it never will happen. And that's the great thing about organizations that help protect people who come forward. That's what's really important, because you never know for sure if that one whistleblower is going to change the safety of the chicken industry or the beef industry or the tomato industry, or save a worker's life or save a child's life. You just never know. And I think that's really one of the most important things about what we all do, that we all need to understand that what we do is so vitally important. It's so vitally important to all of us, to all our families, to all, our clients. It's so vitally important to everything we do. This is, really a time where we still got to keep working. Carolyn and I, admittedly, we're sitting in a bar wondering what was going to happen with the Food Safety Modernization Act just shortly before, the lame duck session was winding down. And admittedly, I was pretty depressed. I was convinced that, the whole system was sort of aligned against us. The bill blew through the House in the way things blow through the House, and they passed it in July of 2009. And then it sort of stagnated in the Senate. And we could all sort of wonder why. It was always an excuse. It was, it's the health bill. You're in favor of the health bill, right, Bill? You should don't give me so much grief. I go, yeah, I'm in favor of the health bill, but this Food Safety Modernization Act is really important to a lot of people. Let's move that. And Carolyn's in the background. Nancy's in the background, pushing. Everybody else is pushing, but it just, wasn't happening. And I'm sitting in the bar with Carolyn. I'm like, I'm just so depressed. It's like Christmas is like next week. It's going to be ugly. I'll tell you my political leanings. The House had flipped to Republicans, and I also knew that the chances of ever having a hearing on food safety with a Republican-led Congress, 0. And I knew that if the bill didn't get out of the Senate, the thing was dead. And here I am sort of sipping my scotch, and Carolyn goes, it's going to work. It's going to happen. And I'm like, only somebody that's lived inside the Beltway for as long as you have can feel that way, because it doesn't feel that way for the people outside the Beltway. And I remember flying home that Friday night and Saturday thinking to myself, what more could I do? Is there anything that I could do? And I had a list of, Republican senators, staffers So I started emailing them like Saturday morning, this is important stuff. Look at this link. This is a real human being. And I kept typing and I kept doing it. My wife was like, we really need to go out to your parents. I'm like, yeah, we'll do that. So I'm texting in the car and I keep doing it. And I keep thinking to myself, about these people that I've represented. And I think about, the butterfly effect. Maybe if I keep texting people, maybe if I do another blog post, somebody will wake up. Maybe now you get to tweet, which, for those of you who do that, it's like a disease. But I kept doing that, and Sunday morning, I got a couple emails back, and I'm like, it's not quite dead yet. And I'm like, and then I email it, well, so what's going on? And I finally get this email, and they said, we think we figured out a way to do this. We've attached it to House Bill something, 2516 or something. So I Googled that, and it was the Cash for Clunkers bill. And I was thinking, here's where I wish, I had Carolyn's cell phone number, but she refuses to give it to me. Here's where I wish I would have called Carolyn and gone, Carolyn, what's going on? And she probably would have easily explained how a food safety bill from the Senate could get stuck into the Cash for Clunkers bill that had already been passed and then sent back to the House so the House could vote on it. But anyway, that's what happened. That's what happened. And, there was this Sunday afternoon, it's like, I can't believe this worked. I can't believe all the work that Nancy's been doing for decades and Carolyn's been doing for decades and all the people who've worked for decades. Carol Tucker Foreman. And then I can't believe how the new people, Jeff Ulmer and the Tousignauxs and the Hurleys, how all of them kind of coming in and, bugging their senator. And Jake Hurley being the cutest little redheaded kid. If you ever seen a picture of him, that kid's going to be president of the United States, if not president of the world someday. All those people pushing, it all kind of came together. And then there was sort of this sense of elation for maybe 12, 24 hours until we realized that there's still more work to do. We can feel good about what happened, but the reality is that there's just a lot more work to do. It needs to be funded, it needs to be monitored, it needs to be tweaked. We need to make sure that the provisions are, rolled out the way they should be. There's going to be a lot of buttonholing of Congress members and senators on all of those issues. And there's still a lot of work still left to be done, on the meat side of the equation. That all needs to be looked at. There's still a lot to do. But the thing that I take out of this is that it's all about taking care of each other. It's all about us doing our little part. It's about me suing a company, me tweeting about something, you coming, you sticking up, you supporting a whistleblower, you buttonholing a Congress member or senator. It's all working together for what we sort of forget sometimes in this country is we're doing this for ourselves and our common good. We all do what we do in different ways, but we're doing it all for the common good. And yeah, we have lots of background noises of, we're liberal wackos and, we're, evil trial lawyers, and we're doing it for greed or we're doing it for publicity. But the reality is that I think deep in our hearts, we all know why we're doing this. We're doing it for Nancy and what happened to her family. We're doing it to, for the Ulmer family. We're doing it because we don't want to see that happen to our loved ones. We don't want to have to deal with that. We don't want to see that happen to our neighbor's kid. I was going to actually give you a PowerPoint presentation, but I sort of got off tangent, and I apologize. And I was going to show you a video of a client of mine, but I want to close on this. You can actually go to my website and see lots of videos. If you go to my blog on the upper left-hand side, if you really want to sort of get depressed and kind of sort of click on some of those videos. And there's a little girl. There's a little girl named Abby Fenstermaker. And Abby was, as her parents will describe her, the kind of kid that sort of lit up a room. But also the kind of kid that, as her father said, you know, if you tell her, don't stand on the bat, it's going to slide out from under you and you'll fall down. She'd be the kid that stands on the bat and slide out from under, because she wanted to learn for herself. And in 2009, her grandfather, who was a Korean War vet, would go, sort of his normal thing he'd do a couple times a week, would go to the VFW hall and hang out with his buddies. And one day got a hamburger. 3 days later, he was sick, then hospitalized, diagnosed with E. coli 015787. Very sick, elderly gentleman, and sick enough that he was hospitalized for several weeks. But he recovered. But one of the things that, you know, they had him in isolation, and Abby couldn't visit Grandpa. But as soon as he got into the rehab, they said it was okay for her to visit. So she loved her grandpa. She ran there, no more infectious disease precautions. She jumped into bed and gave Grandpa a kiss. They hugged, and, you know, she said, you know, it's going to be great to have you home, Grandpa. 3 days later, Abby's sick. A week later, she's dead from E. coli 015787. So it's not just the people that eat the hamburger, it's other people, family. And sitting across the table with this family in, you know, working class Cleveland, you know, it's their one and only child, watching just the pain of the husband's face, watching the anguish in his mother's eyes, you know, was so palpable that I kept thinking to myself, it's like, I wonder what it would be like to have the company director to do that. And I wonder what it would be like to have Secretary Vilsack meet this person. I wonder how that would change them. I wonder if, like me, that Abby is constantly on my mind. She's constantly a sort of a touchstone of, oh, do I have to go to Washington, D.C. again? Do I have to go to this meeting again? Do I have to go meet with a bunch of suits at the Justice Department again? Wouldn't it be more fun to drive around in my Mercedes-Benz throwing cash out the window? Think about that. Think about that when doing what we do, because it's real. I'll leave you with one story, and then since it's only 7 o'clock in the morning here, and I'm from Seattle, and I haven't had my 12th cup of coffee, I'm going to have a cup of coffee. There's a first case I ever had was the Jack in the Box E. coli case. Sickened several hundred people, killed 4 kids. I got to know a guy by the name of Dave Thino, who's vice president of Jack in the Box. He came in after the outbreak. Dave and I deposed him a whole bunch of times, and we hated each other for several years until I realized I was at a conference and he told this story. It was a conference that I spoke at as well. It was a National Meat Association. He got applause, and for some reason I didn't, and I'm never quite sure why. But he tells a story that I think is sort of in line with my idea that I think people need, especially in positions of power, need to really pay attention to ultimately what it is that they do. And there was a young girl who died in that outbreak, and Dave would carry her photograph with him, and he'd have it in his briefcase. And when he had to make a food safety decision, he'd pull that photograph out and look at it and say, what would Lauren have me do? Now, it's a little morose. It's a little morose. But it sort of underscores the point about how important it is, the things that we do. And, you know, whether you're a professor writing an article, an advocate putting a point forward, somebody supporting a whistleblower, somebody thinking about being a whistleblower, somebody being a lawyer who would, you know, rather sometimes be doing something else than coming to Washington, D.C. Think about it. Think about the Abbeys. Think about the Laurens. Think about what we're trying to accomplish and keep pushing, keep probing, keep handing the baton off, because eventually, good things will happen. We have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of issues that we're going to face in the future. But, you know, I'm confident that if you take that little bit of extra time, you know, you keep pushing, you keep prodding, things get better. Things do get better. So thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to be here the whole day. I look forward to, you know, hearing from the whistleblowers. At noon today, I have a bunch of folks from people who were victims of the PCA outbreak are going to do a little press conference to talk about, you know, justice from their perspective. I thank the university for hosting this, and GAP for all the great work they do. And John Munsell's a good friend of mine. I admire all the work that everyone's doing here. So thank you very much.